This stage continues the planking up to layer 12. Fit the first plank of layer 10 between frames 17 and 24. As before, chamfer its edge to get a good fit. As the side of the hull is not curved, less chamfering will be needed. The stern planks should not need tapering. Just check that they run parallel to the line of the deck. Use the card template to check the overhang of the stern. As we have done previously, glue the plank and the ribs and secure with pins. Continue with the bow plank. It will probably leave a gap in the middle, however the size and position of the gap will depend on how much you have tapered the bow planks. On the next row, which is layer 11, fit the first plank from frame 16 to 23 and fit the aft plank from frame 23 to the stern overhang. Once again, using the template and marking off where the plank needs to be cut to size. Now glue the ribs and then pin the plank to the side of your model as shown. Continue the planking with layer 12. Start by fixing the first plank between frames 15 and 22. Then add the stern planks, checking the overhang with your card template as before. Check with a ruler to make sure that layer 12 sits above the bow formers. If they do not sit above the bow formers, you will need to add more planking. Make a marking gauge from a piece of plank about 150 mm long. Slice off 0.5 mm to make the plank 4.5 mm wide. Then bend it to the curve to fit the side of the hull similar to the jig you made to mark the lower gun ports. Continue to draw the lines as we did before. At the bows, draw lines directly against the sides of frames 12 and 13 as shown. Make a gauge to mark the height of the gun ports shown here, which are 31 mm above the bottom edge of the lowest plank. Refer to page 110 of your instructions. Hold the jig against the bottom plank and draw a line across the top of the jig to mark the bottom of the gun port. Repeat this at every port position, including the entry port. Using the 12 mm square jig you made for marking the lower gun ports or a ruler, mark the gun ports according to the photos and the diagram. Don't forget to mark the port against the forward line at frame 15. Extend the vertical lines both up and down to mark out the entry ports between frame 21 and 22. You can leave marking the top and bottom of the entry port until later. The gun port should be between frames 27 and 28 and should be flush with the edge of frame 28. The gun port by frame 25 should be drawn approximately 1 mm closer toward the bows than the marked line. There is one further gun port to cut at the bow. Draw a line 31mm forward of the front of the gun port next to frame 12. The jig you made earlier to mark the height of the port. Take both strips provided for the canning supports and paint one side black, taking care not to get paint on the edges. Now mark out and cut 24 pieces 20mm long and 4 pieces 15mm long. A razor saw and mitre block are the easiest tools for doing this neatly. Glue the cannon supports on top of the support beams with the black painted side facing the planking. Line up the supports behind the gun ports that you have marked to ensure that they will provide good support for the cannons. Note that the shorter strips are for the bow and stern. Let the glue dry overnight before continuing. Use any sharp pointed tool to make a small hole in the centre of each gun port to help position the drill accurately. Then drill a hole through the centre of each gun port using a 2mm drill bit. Use a straight edge against the underside of the deck to help you keep the drill upright and parallel to the deck. You will need to use a small chisel to remove the wood from the gun port in the bow. In this step we will be cutting the entry ports. Check that your craft knife has a sharp blade and then cut from the corners to the centre as you did for the gun ports. Carefully trim away the wood at the bottom of the entry port to extend the hole down until it is flush with the deck. Do this in small steps, checking from the inside as well as the outside of the hull. Take a ruler and measure 23mm from the bottom of the entry port in order to mark the top of the entry port with a pencil line as shown. Remove the wood from the top of the entry port, again leaving about 1mm spare for final trimming. Finish off the edges of the entry port with an emery board or nail file. In the next step we're going to continue the planking, so carry on planking the hull up to the level of the shortest rib frames. Place the first plank of layer 13 in position between frames 17 and 24. Mark and cut it to length, then chamfer the edge and glue and pin the plank into position. Fit the stern plank using your card template as a guide to cutting the overhanging end of the plank. Fit the forward plank, cutting it so that it overhangs the forward bulkhead by a few millimetres. Note that if your model required layer 12 to curve all the way around to complete the bow planking, this may be the first layer that stops at this point. The planks at the bow need to be tapered toward it so that the top plank will end up roughly parallel to the top of the frames. The amount of tapering needed will vary from one model to another. Taper each plank a little rather than doing it all on one plank. And do not worry if the tops of the ribs are not completely level, as they will be trimmed later. Now test fit the plank before gluing into position. Now fit the next layer of planks, with the first plank fitted between frames 16 and 25. Trim the bow and stern planks as shown previously. The chamfer of the planks in the bow area needs careful attention. The shape changes along the length of each plank as it twists to follow the line of the frames. Check frequently against the model and trim the planks to fit. Continue with the next layer as per step 7 on page 115. Before continuing with the next layer of planks, mark the finished height of the planking. The deck and deck beams will be 3.5mm thick, so mark a line on frame numbers 17 to 21, 4mm above the bracket that supports the deck. The extra 0.5mm is a small allowance for sanding. Take 2 scraps of plank and use these as a gauge to mark the required height. Using a steel rule or an offcut on the hull, mark the forward line of the frames on the planking. For the gun ports nearest the stern, draw the line of the aft edge of the lower gun port and then draw a parallel line 2mm forward of that point. For the next gun port, draw a parallel line 1mm forward of the frame. Make a marking gauge similar to the one you made in an earlier stage. The distance from the top piece to the end is 57mm. Use this 57mm gauge to mark the height of the gun ports on the upper deck. Using the same process as before, draw the outline of all 15 gun ports on each side. The 2 gun ports nearest the stern are slightly forward of the lower ports along the extra lines you drew. The port nearest the bow is exactly above the lower gun port, midway between the frames. Cut out the gun ports using the same techniques as for the lower and the middle gun ports as you did before.